What happens when you're focused on solving one mystery and the ranch decides to throw an entirely different one at you? That's exactly the situation the team walks into in this episode, and the answer is far stranger than anyone on the property was prepared for. Welcome back, everyone. I'm taking you deep into Season 7, Episode 9 of The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch, titled Up in Smoke. And I have to tell you right up front, this one caught me completely off guard. Just when I thought I had a handle on where this season was headed, this episode flips the whole script. And I mean that in the best possible way. Let me set the stage for you. By this point in Season 7, the research team has been building serious momentum. The rocket launch in the previous episode delivered one of the most concrete atmospheric breakthroughs the investigation has ever produced. And heading into Episode 9, there's a real sense that the team is finally starting to connect some long-standing dots. So when this episode opens, with the crew shifting their focus to Homestead 2, it feels like a natural next step. Homestead 2 has been on the team's radar for seasons now, a location on the property with its own history of strange activity and unanswered questions. Targeting it with fresh energy and fresh tools after the momentum of the last episode makes total sense on paper. But here's the thing about Skinwalker Ranch that this show has hammered home again and again across 7 seasons. The moment you think you know where the action is going to happen, the property has other ideas. And in Up in Smoke, that lesson comes through louder and clearer than it has in a long time. I've been watching this show long enough to know that pattern well. The ranch doesn't follow a script. It doesn't cooperate with investigation plans. And it absolutely does not perform on cue just because a team of researchers with expensive equipment shows up expecting results. That unpredictability is baked into the DNA of this property, and every season seems to find a new way to remind the team and the audience that no amount of preparation fully accounts for what this place is capable of throwing at you. Episode 9 is a masterclass in exactly that reminder. And what makes it hit harder than most similar moments in past seasons is how perfectly timed the redirection feels. It's not chaos. It's almost deliberate. And that distinction is what I keep coming back to as I think through what this episode is really showing us. What I find most fascinating about this episode right from the start is the deliberate, methodical way the team approaches Homestead 2. There's no scrambling here, no reacting to something unexpected. This is a planned, coordinated investigation, the kind that comes from having a clear objective and the tools to pursue it. The whole point is to smoke out answers from a location that has historically resisted giving them up easily. And I'll say this, watching the team work through that process is compelling in its own right, because it shows you just how much thought and preparation goes into even a single day of investigation on this property. Nothing about what they do at Homestead 2 is casual. Every step is calculated, every instrument is placed with intention, and every reading is tracked carefully against the baseline data they've accumulated from previous visits to this area. As I'm watching the early scenes unfold at Homestead 2, there's a real sense of focused intensity that I genuinely appreciate after some of the more scattered episodes earlier in the season. The team knows what they're looking for, and they're going about finding it in an organized, systematic way. It's the kind of investigative discipline that doesn't always make for the flashiest television, but it's exactly what serious research looks like. And this show is at its best when it leans into that authenticity. There's also a personal investment in Homestead 2. that I pick up on in how the team carries themselves during these early scenes. This isn't a location they're visiting for the first time with fresh, wide-open curiosity. These are researchers who've been to this spot before, who've pulled readings from it in past seasons, and who have unresolved questions sitting in the back of their minds that this visit is designed to address. That accumulated history with a specific location gives the investigation a different texture than a first-time exploration. There's patience in it, a willingness to be methodical, because they understand that Homestead Two doesn't give up its secrets quickly. Watching that patience in action, especially given everything that's about to happen elsewhere on the ranch, adds a layer of poignancy to these early scenes that I find genuinely affecting. But then something shifts. And when I say shifts, I mean the episode takes a turn that I honestly didn't see come, even knowing this show's history of throwing curveballs. While the team is deep into their work at Homestead Two, anomalies start appearing somewhere else entirely on the ranch. Not subtle blips, not the kind of minor fluctuations that could be chalked up to equipment sensitivity or environmental factors. We're talking about unexpected, clearly anomalous activity popping up in a completely different area of the property. One that wasn't even on the team's radar for this particular investigation. And the timing of it is what really gets under my skin. It doesn't happen before the team arrives at Homestead Two. It doesn't happen after they leave. It happens while they're fully committed elsewhere, as if the ranch is deliberately drawing a line between where the team chose to look and where the real action decided to show up. Now, I want to be careful here not to jump straight to conclusions, because one of the things I've always respected about this show is that the better episodes don't do that either. The team doesn't see the anomalies at the secondary location and immediately declare it proof of some grand conspiracy by the ranch itself. Instead, they do what good researchers do. They document it, they cross-reference it against what they know about that area of the property, and they start asking the right questions about what could be causing it and why it's happening now. That methodical reaction to unexpected phenomena is something I find refreshing every time this show gets it right. Because the easier path, the path that would arguably generate more immediate drama, would be to have the team drop everything and sprint toward the new activity. Instead, they hold their ground at Homestead 2 long enough to gather meaningful data there, while simultaneously spinning up monitoring in the area where the new anomalies are appearing. That split focus approach is harder to execute and harder to film in a way that keeps the viewer engaged. But it reflects a genuine maturity in how the investigation is being run, and I think it's one of the reasons Season 7 has felt like a step forward compared to some earlier installments of the show. But even with that measured approach, the implications of what's being detected are hard to shake. I've spent enough time watching this investigation unfold to know that activity appearing in a separate, unmonitored part of the ranch at the exact same time the team is focused on a completely different location isn't something that gets easily explained away. The property has a documented history of this kind of behavior, where phenomena seem to respond to the presence and attention of the researchers in ways that don't fit any conventional model of how passive environmental anomalies are supposed to work. What makes this particular instance feel different from similar moments in past seasons is the clarity of it. A lot of the time on this show, the corroborating evidence between what's happening in two different places is indirect, requiring a lot of interpretive work to connect the dots. In Up in Smoke, though, The contrast between what the team is experiencing at Homestead 2 and what's registering at the separate location is sharp enough that it doesn't require much interpretation at all. Something is happening. It's happening somewhere nobody expected it. And the timing relative to the main investigation at Homestead 2 is, at the very least, deeply worth examining. I also want to talk about what this episode means for the broader arc of Season 7, because I think it's as easy to watch Up in Smoke as a standalone episode and miss how much it's actually doing in terms of the season's larger narrative. Each episode of this show carries its own weight as a self-contained investigation, but the best ones also function as chapters in a longer story, adding something to the season-wide picture that wouldn't exist without them. Up in Smoke is very much in that category. Pulling it out of context would give you an interesting hour of television. Watching it as part of what Season 7 has been building toward gives it a significantly deeper resonance. Coming off the breakthrough in Episode 8, there was a reasonable expectation that Season 7's back half would be largely about following up on the atmospheric discoveries made during the rocket experiment, digging deeper into what the data revealed and seeing how it connects to other phenomena on the property. And to some extent, that thread is still alive in this episode. The work at Homestead 2 isn't disconnected from the findings of the previous episode. There's a logic to why the team is there and what they're hoping to find. But Up in Smoke complicates that expected trajectory in an interesting way. By introducing unexpected and anomaly activity in a completely separate location, the episode essentially forces the narrative to branch. Now, there are two significant threads running simultaneously, and the question of how they connect, if they connect, becomes one of the most compelling hanging questions heading into the later episodes of the season. That's smart storytelling, whether you frame this as a documentary or an investigative series, because it keeps the viewer engaged, not just with what's happening in the moment, but with what it might mean down the line. Speaking of what it might mean, let me share what I think is the most thought-provoking element of this whole episode. The question of whether the anomalies appearing at the secondary location are connected to the work being done at Homestead 2, or whether they're entirely independent. This is the kind of question that sounds simple on the surface, but becomes genuinely complicated the longer you sit with it. And I've been sitting with it since I first watched this episode, turning it over from different angles, and I still don't think there's a clean answer. What I do think is that the question itself matters, because depending on which direction the evidence points, the implications for understanding this property are very different. On the surface, those sound like two very different possibilities. But when you think about what we know about this property from 7 seasons of investigation, the line between those two scenarios gets blurry fast. If the anomalies at the secondary location are independent of the Homestead 2 investigation, then what we're seeing is evidence of the ranch being simultaneously active in multiple areas, which in itself is significant. It suggests the phenomena here aren't localized to the spots the team has traditionally focused on, and that there may be entire regions of the property generating unusual readings that simply haven't been monitored closely enough yet. On the other hand, if the anomalies are somehow connected to the work being done at Homestead 2, that raises an entirely different set of questions about the nature of what's happening on this land. Is there some kind of underlying system here that reacts to disturbance in one area by generating activity in another? That's a genuinely unsettling possibility. And it's the kind of thing this show handles well when it's operating at its best. Not by declaring an answer, but by laying out the evidence clearly enough that the viewer can feel the weight of the question. One of the things I keep coming back to as I think about this episode is how it reflects the unpredictability that has always been the defining characteristic of Skinwalker Ranch as an investigation site. Even with all the equipment, all the expertise, and all the accumulated knowledge the team brings to the property, at this stage of the show, the ranch still manages to surprise them. And honestly, that's part of why this show continues to hold my attention the way it does. If every episode followed a neat, predictable structure where the team investigates a target, finds exactly what they're looking for, and moves on, it would feel sanitized. It would feel like a show that's been too tidily produced, to be honest about what the investigation actually looks like from the inside. Up in Smoke is honest in the way that counts, which means it's messy, it's surprising, and it refuses to go exactly where you expect it to. Now, let me talk about Homestead 2 specifically for a moment, because I don't want that half of the episode to get overshadowed by the drama happening at the secondary location. The work the team does there in this episode is genuinely interesting on its own terms. Homestead 2 has always been one of those places on the ranch that carries an air of significance, the kind of location that gets referenced across multiple seasons without ever being fully investigated to the team's satisfaction. There's a history tied to that spot, both in terms of what previous occupants of the property reportedly experienced there, and in terms of the anomalous readings the current team has picked up during past visits. In this episode, the team brings a more structured approach to Homestead 2 than I've seen in some of the earlier, more exploratory visits. The intent is clearly to try to systematically account for what's been detected there before, to see whether what the team is measuring now lines up with past data, and whether there's a pattern that might explain the location's persistent association with unusual phenomena. That kind of disciplined revisit is valuable, even when it doesn't deliver an explosive breakthrough, because it builds the body of documented evidence that serious research depends on. From what I can see, the work at Homestead 2 in this episode does add useful pieces to that ongoing picture, even as the unexpected activity at the secondary location threatens to pull everyone's attention elsewhere. That tension between staying committed to a planned investigation and responding to something unexpected happening in a different part of the ranch is something I find genuinely relatable about this show. It mirrors a challenge that comes up in a lot of real investigative work. How do you balance the discipline of following a structured plan with the flexibility to respond to new information when it shows up uninvited? The team handles that balance differently depending on the episode, and in Up in Smoke, watching them navigate that choice in real time is one of the most engaging parts of the experience. What also strikes me about this episode is what it says about the maturity of the investigation at this stage of the show. Earlier seasons often featured moments where unexpected activity would pull the entire team off whatever they were doing to go chase the new thing, sometimes abandoning promising lines of inquiry in the process. There was an impulsiveness to it that was understandable given the circumstances, but it also meant that a lot of investigations ended up incomplete because something shinier came along. By season 7, I'm seeing a different approach. The team doesn't entirely abandon Homestead 2. just because something unusual is happening elsewhere. They try to maintain both threads simultaneously, which requires a level of organizational discipline and resource management that wasn't always visible in earlier seasons. That growth in how the investigation is managed is something I think deserves recognition because it makes the research feel more credible and more sustainable as it continues. And that credibility matters to me as someone who has followed the show closely for a long time. One of the common criticisms leveled at investigation-based reality television is that the drama often gets prioritized over the science, that decisions are made for television value rather than research value. Up in Smoke pushes back against that criticism in a meaningful way. The choice to hold discipline at Homestead Two rather than immediately chasing the new anomaly is not the more dramatic choice. It's the more scientifically sound one. And the fact that the show frames it that way, respecting the audience's ability to understand why that discipline matters, is exactly the kind of editorial integrity that keeps me coming back to this series season after season. As the episode moves through its second half, the focus shifts more heavily toward the anomalous activity at the secondary location, and this is where Up in Smoke really starts to hit its stride. The documentation of what's being detected there is handled carefully, and I appreciate that the team takes the time to rule out the most obvious mundane explanations before starting to draw wider conclusions. That skeptical discipline is what keeps this show grounded, even when the phenomena being documented are genuinely difficult to explain through conventional means. I also want to acknowledge something about how this second half shift is paced, because I think the editing and structure of this episode deserve some credit. A lesser production might have rushed to the secondary location the moment activity started being detected there, cutting away from Homestead 2 too quickly and leaving the viewer without adequate context for what the team found or didn't find at the original investigation site. Instead, Up in Smoke gives both locations their due attention. By the time the episode's center of gravity moves toward the new anomaly site, I feel fully oriented in the Homestead 2 work that preceded it, which makes the contrast between the two locations land with more force. The deliberate pacing earns the payoff, and in a show where pacing doesn't always get the credit it deserves, that's worth calling out explicitly. What gets detected at the secondary location in this episode isn't something I'm going to spell out in complete detail here, because part of the value of this breakdown is pointing you toward the episode itself. What I will say is that it fits into a broader pattern of activity on the ranch that the team has been tracking for years, a pattern that keeps pointing towards something deeper and more complex than any single anomaly or isolated incident can account for on its own. Up in Smoke adds a new and unexpected data point to that pattern, one that I think is going to carry real weight as the season continues toward its conclusion. There's also a moment near the end of this episode that I think will stick with viewers long after the credits roll. Without going into specifics, it's a moment where the scale of what's happening on this property, the breadth of it, not just the depth, really comes into focus. The idea that the ranch might be generating unexplained activity across multiple separate locations simultaneously during a single investigation is a lot to sit with. It reframes the entire enterprise of trying to understand Skinwalker Ranch in a way that I find genuinely exciting, not because it makes the mystery seem solvable, but because it makes it seem even richer and more layered than the investigation has previously been able to capture. I think one of the things Up in Smoke does better than a lot of episodes this season is remind the viewer why the scale of this investigation matters. It's easy to get focused on a single location, a single anomaly, a single line of inquiry, and lose sight of the fact that Skinwalker Ranch is a large, complex property with a long and strange history. This episode pulls the camera back, figuratively speaking, and forces everyone watching to think about the ranch as a whole rather than just its most famous or most frequently studied corners. That wider perspective is valuable, and it opens up questions about the full scope of what's happening here that the show is going to need to grapple with seriously if it wants to keep pushing the investigation forward. By the time the episode wraps, I'm left with a feeling I don't always get from individual episodes of this show, a genuine sense that the ground has shifted. Not in an explosive, everything is resolved kind of way, but in a quieter, more consequential way. Up in Smoke doesn't hand you a tidy answer. What it does is expand the map of the mystery, showing you that the territory the team is trying to chart is even larger and stranger than you might have assumed coming in. And for a show that has been building towards something across 7 seasons, that kind of expansion feels meaningful rather than frustrating. Heading into the final stretch of Season 7, I'm genuinely curious about how the team is going to handle everything that this episode has set in motion. They've got unfinished business at Homestead 2, fresh anomaly data from a location that wasn't even on their original itinerary for this episode, and a growing body of evidence suggesting the ranch is more broadly active than their current monitoring setup is equipped to capture. That combination of open threads is exactly the kind of investigative pressure that produces the most compelling television, and I'm here for every second of it. The work at Homestead 2 is unfinished. The anomalies at the secondary location raise questions that are going to need follow-up. And the broader picture of what's happening across the ranch, not just in the triangle or at the most frequently investigated spots, is starting to look more complicated and more interesting than ever. If the rest of this season can maintain the energy and the investigative integrity that Up in Smoke delivers, we're heading toward a finale that could be one of the most significant in the show's history. So if you haven't watched this one yet, make it a priority. And if you have, I'd genuinely love to hear what you took away from it, especially that moment near the end that I think is going to spark a lot of conversation going into next week. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next breakdown. Before I go, I want to leave you with the thought that keeps nagging at me after watching Up in Smoke. The show has always asked the question of what Skinwalker Ranch actually is. What's at the root of all these decades of unexplained phenomena? But this episode quietly shifts that question into something sharper. It's no longer just about what the ranch is. It's about how much of it we're actually seeing. If anomalous activity can appear simultaneously in separate, unmonitored areas of the property the moment the team commits its attention elsewhere, then how much has been happening across the full extent of this land that nobody has ever been positioned to detect? That's not a comfortable thought. And it's exactly the kind of uncomfortable thought that makes this investigation, even after 7 seasons, feel like it's still only scratching the surface of something enormous. Stay tuned, because I have a feeling the rest of this season is going to keep pushing on that question in ways we're not fully expecting.